A nation cannot build its future upon the silence of its starving children and the hidden fortunes of its leaders. When youth unemployment surges past 60% across South Africa, when hundreds of thousands of qualified university graduates are stranded without hope, and when infants in the Eastern Cape suffer in clinics stripped of basic medicine, the promise of liberation stands in direct contradiction with lived reality. While families endure economic darkness, power remains insulated behind high walls and entrenched privilege. Then from the podium at Pietermaritzburg City Hall, Julius Malema shattered the official narrative, demanding an immediate reckoning with political patronage and the systemic neglect gripping the country. If wealth grows, but inequality deepens, who is development, really? For do not look away. What you are about to examine is not merely a political speech, but a turning point in the struggle for truth. If this quest for accountability resonates with you, subscribe to South African Dynamics, like this broadcast, and join our growing community of conscience. This is not simply a contest between rival factions. It is an urgent confrontation over whether public authority serves the people or protects elite comfort. As political tensions mount across KwaZulu-Natal, the central battle for economic justice and human dignity has begun. Inside the historic walls of Pietermaritzburg City Hall, the air hung heavy with the unmistakable weight of historical grievance and mounting political tension. Thousands of economic freedom fighters supporters clad in disciplined ranks of red berets gathered not merely for a routine political assembly, but for a direct reckoning with the governance of South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal has long stood as a fiercely contested battleground, an epicenter where regional grievances collide with national policy failures. Yet on this afternoon, the focus shifted entirely from routine electioneering to the devastating reality confronting millions of households across the Republic. For over a decade, the promise of broad-based economic empowerment has dissolved into empty pronouncements, leaving working families to navigate unprecedented hardship, while the political elite remains entirely insulated from the everyday struggle for survival. At the heart of this confrontation lies the South Africa unemployment crisis, a catastrophic structural failure that has left more than 10 million people without formal livelihood. Across the country, youth unemployment has climbed past an alarming 60%, locking an entire generation out of the national economy before their working lives have even begun. Industrial corridors that once hummed with manufacturing and textile production now stand completely silent, their gates padlocked and their machinery left to rust. From the manufacturing hubs of Durban to the commercial centers of Gauteng, domestic industry is collapsing under the weight of crumbling infrastructure, persistent logistical bottlenecks, and deep policy paralysis. Instead of industrial expansion, citizens are met with factory closures. Instead of job creation, communities are offered managed decline. Yet, as Julius Malema pointed out with razor-sharp clarity from the podium, the ruling establishment has consistently sought refuge in political diversion rather than confronting its own systemic failures. For years, state officials and opportunistic political actors have constructed a convenient scapegoat directing public frustration toward foreign nationals and convincing struggling citizens that migrant workers from neighboring Zimbabwe are the root cause of their domestic misery. In elaborate public displays, the state organized convoys of deportation buses, sending thousands of vulnerable workers across the northern border under the pretext of restoring domestic employment. But reality dismantled the illusion almost immediately. Within 24 hours of those buses departing, official state agencies released their latest economic bulletins, revealing that national unemployment had escalated once again. The foreign workers were gone. Yet the economic desperation remained entirely unchanged, proving conclusively that migrant labor was never the author of this collapse. This calculated diversion speaks to a deeper moral decay within governance, illustrating the permanent collision between integrity versus corruption. Rather than confronting the policy failures that shuttered local manufacturing plants and paralyzed infrastructure development, those occupying the seat of power chose to weaponize societal frustration. A functional head of state is judged by tangible development, by the physical construction of new schools, the establishment of 24-hour healthcare facilities, and the ribbon-cutting ceremonies that signal the arrival of working factories and modern transport networks. When a president ceases to commission public works, when state leadership fails to turn the country into a vast engine of production, executive office is reduced to administrative stagnation. The absence of industrial progress is not an unfortunate accident. It is the natural consequence of governance that prioritizes factional preservation over national welfare. As the crowd inside Pietermaritzburg City Hall roared its approval, Malema pushed his analysis beyond the visible symptoms of closed factories and stagnant construction yards, preparing to peel back the layers of executive privilege. For if the national treasury was supposedly exhausted, and if public funds were genuinely insufficient to sustain industrial development or feed impoverished children, a far darker question demanded an answer. Into whose private pockets had the nation's stolen wealth truly disappeared? That afternoon in Pietermaritzburg, the atmosphere crossed a decisive threshold from political critique into an explosive moral indictment. Standing before an electrified assembly, Julius Malema delivered an unsparing exposure of executive power, centering his assault on the notorious revelations surrounding the president's private estate at Phala Phala. The scandal involving hundreds of thousands of United States dollars concealed within domestic furniture was stripped of all administrative euphemism. Malema drew an arresting and provocative historical parallel, comparing the incumbent head of state President Cyril Ramaphosa directly to the infamous Colombian cartel boss Pablo Escobar. To the roaring crowd, the comparison was neither hyperbole nor casual insult. It was framed as an essential diagnosis of a political elite that hoards concealed wealth, while the society it governs collapses into absolute penury. The rhetoric laid bare a grotesque spatial reality. Malema described an accumulation of illicit cash so overwhelming that ordinary storage ceased to function. When bedrooms and private chambers overflow with hidden currency, banknotes are stuffed beneath mattresses, pushed deep into sofa cushions, and eventually buried beneath the earth. Just as Escobar's hidden stashes continue to be unearthed across the Colombian countryside decades later, the imagery of foreign banknotes concealed inside the furniture of a sitting president became the defining symbol of state capture and systemic betrayal. In Malema's telling, this was not the conduct of a constitutional statesman bound by the rule of law. It was the behavior of an untouchable syndicate operating above democratic scrutiny. The power of this indictment drew its force from the devastating visceral contrast with the lived reality of ordinary citizens across South Africa. While vast sums of foreign money sat insulated inside executive upholstery, children in the rural reaches of the Eastern Cape were literally perishing from severe malnutrition and chronic hunger. Mothers in forgotten villages were digging graves for infants who died not from incurable disease, but from the simple, brutal absence of food. In neglected provincial clinics and regional hospitals, public healthcare had collapsed to the point of barbarism. Expectant mothers were forced to give birth directly on cold concrete floors, while newborn infants were placed in discarded cardboard boxes for lack of basic cribs and clean bedding. Simultaneously, the children of the working class, the very youth who had fought their way through higher education, found their futures held hostage. Thousands of graduates who had completed rigorous university degrees were denied their graduation certificates because their impoverished families could not settle outstanding institutional debts. They were left stranded in the townships qualified to build the nation, yet legally prohibited from proving their credentials. The moral contradiction was total. A head of state possessed surplus cash to conceal beneath sofa cushions, while the sons and daughters of ordinary workers were denied the basic documentation required to secure employment. This staggering disparity between executive wealth and communal deprivation galvanized the hall into unified fury. The response from the audience was an overwhelming affirmation of dignity against institutional callousness. For the gathered masses, this was not an issue that could be resolved through polite parliamentary debates, presidential commissions of inquiry, or managed bureaucratic compromises. Not reform, not rhetoric, accountability. As national media broadcasters carried the speech across the Republic and into the international sphere, the political establishment scrambled to manage the fallout of such an uncompromising denunciation. But the exposure had already landed with seismic force. Malema had demonstrated that the crisis of South Africa was not merely an administrative failure, but an existential conflict between those who monopolize national resources and those who are systematically discarded. Yet, beneath the immediate shock of hidden fortunes and institutional neglect lay an even more insidious architecture, a modern economic structure designed to commodify the fundamental necessities of human life. Beyond the immediate shock of undisclosed executive fortunes lies a far more calculated systemic transformation, the transition from legal apartheid to economic exclusion. Under the former regime, the architecture of oppression was explicit, enforced by racial decrees, spatial zoning, and physical segregation. Today, as public infrastructure is systematically commercialized, the mechanics of exclusion operate through the unforgiving logic of the market. Nowhere is this transformation more destructive than in the provision of basic utilities, where state-owned enterprises have abandoned their public mandates in pursuit of commercial margins. Over the past decade, residential electricity tariffs levied by the state power utility, Eskom, have surged by more than 400%. This deliberate pricing strategy has transformed electricity from an essential public right into an unattainable luxury for millions of impoverished citizens. When families are forced to choose between purchasing basic groceries and keeping their lights on, poverty is not an unfortunate circumstance. It is an enforced reality. This deliberate commodification has created a profound crisis within the social fabric of the Republic. In urban townships and forgotten informal settlements, access to power is no longer determined by racial legislation, but by the ability to pay exorbitant corporate rates. The consequences inside ordinary homes are devastating. Children study by candlelight in cramped dwellings, small local businesses collapse under punitive energy costs, and communities are plunged into darkness while private energy conglomerates secure lucrative state-backed contracts. As the wider South Africa political crisis deepens, the foundational social contract between the citizen and the state has effectively disintegrated. The state no longer functions as a protector of universal human dignity, but as a ruthless debt collector presiding over an economy that treats human needs as tradable commodities. This structural violence extends directly into the institutions of higher learning, where a parallel betrayal is underway against the nation's youth. Across 9 provinces, hundreds of thousands of qualified young men and women have completed demanding degree programs in engineering, science, economics, and humanities, only to find their diplomas confiscated by university administrations due to outstanding historical student debt. These young scholars, predominantly from rural and working-class backgrounds, represent the very intellectual capital required to rebuild the Republic. Instead, they are trapped in institutional limbo, qualified to teach, to build, and to heal, yet legally barred from presenting the certificates that would allow them to enter the formal economy. They walk the streets of the major metropolises as an invisible army of the educated, dispossessed, their sacrifices invalidated by administrative rigidity. In this definitive Julius Malema speech, the leader of the economic freedom fighters connected these disparate points of failure into a unified indictment of state policy. By refusing to cancel historic student debt and failing to deploy these qualified graduates into the civil service, the administration actively sabotages its own developmental potential. Malema argued that replacing corrupt political appointees with these skilled, unemployed youth would not only dismantle patronage networks, but instantly modernize local administration. The crisis of the educated unemployed is not a consequence of personal failure, but the direct result of a governing framework that protects elite privilege while locking out its most capable citizens. Pause with us for a moment Write in the comments section below where you are watching from, whether from across the United States, the Caribbean, the African continent, or anywhere in the world. South African Dynamics would like to express our deepest gratitude to everyone who stands with us in analyzing these critical issues. We send our heartfelt wishes for peace, resilience, and dignity to your home. Let your voice be heard in the discussion below, as we examine how ordinary citizens can reclaim control over their national destiny. The domestic consequences of this economic model are undeniable, generating a combustible atmosphere of popular unrest, community strikes, and deepening political estrangement across every province. Yet the profound domestic rupture occurring across South Africa does not exist in a regional or diplomatic vacuum. As the foundations of governance tremble, how are international powers, Western financial institutions, and continental allies responding to the mounting prospect of a revolutionary political realignment across the international diplomatic landscape? The deepening political tremors inside South Africa are being observed with profound concern and intense strategic calculation. From Washington to Brussels, and within the diplomatic corridors of the African Union in Addis Ababa, foreign policy analysts recognize that South Africa is not merely another emerging market. It remains the industrial, financial, and logistical anchor of the African continent, possessing immense mineral reserves, advanced banking institutions, and critical maritime shipping lanes. Consequently, systemic instability or widespread governance breakdown within the Republic carries profound consequences for the global economy. When domestic institutions fracture under the weight of unresolved ethical crises, international capital markets react with immediate volatility, further depressing sovereign credit ratings and elevating the cost of national borrowing. For international observers and members of the African diaspora who have long championed the struggle for African self-determination, the persistence of the Phala Phala scandal represents a profound moral disappointment. Decades after the formal collapse of apartheid, the aspiration was to see a sovereign African democracy emerge as an unassailable global model of ethical governance, constitutional supremacy, and equitable development. Instead, the persistent revelations of systemic South Africa corruption have damaged the Republic's international credibility, complicating diplomatic relations with major Western partners and multilateral lending agencies alike. Global commentators increasingly ask whether the post-1994 political settlement was designed merely to swap administrative custodians while leaving the underlying structures of economic disenfranchisement completely undisturbed. Within the United States and across international media networks, analytical coverage of Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters has shifted from viewing the party as a fringe populist formation to recognizing it as a formidable catalyst of ideological realignment. While Western editorial boards frequently express unease regarding radical proposals for economic nationalization, independent foreign policy analysts acknowledge that the explosive grievances driving the Red Beret movement cannot be ignored. The international community understands that when 60% of a nation's youth is excluded from productive economic life, political radicalism is not an artificial creation. It is the inevitable byproduct of prolonged structural neglect. The central question confronting global powers is no longer whether South Africa's governing consensus can endure, but what alternative economic framework will inevitably replace it. As the old political order disintegrates under the weight of its own unfulfilled pledges, the battle for the Republic's future moves from the realm of international diplomacy back to the ground, where an exhausted electorate must now decide whether to surrender to managed decline or demand a revolutionary industrial reconstruction. Saluang to Task 4432-2. To dismantle this entrenched machinery of stagnation, the roadmap forward demands nothing less than a total structural reimagining of the South African state. For the economic freedom fighters, the path toward national recovery cannot be paved with half measures, cosmetic cabinet reshuffles, or empty promises of incremental fiscal reform. The immediate priority must be the complete transformation of the Republic into an active, productive construction site where state capacity is built from the ground up. In Julius Malema's economic vision, true recovery requires the decisive mobilization of public capital to revive shuttered domestic factories, modernize crumbling transport arteries, and establish comprehensive public services in every neglected township and rural municipality. By terminating the entrenched culture of political patronage and deploying qualified unemployed graduates into the civil service, the administration can replace bureaucratic paralysis with genuine technical competence. This strategic pivot directly confronts the long-standing contradiction between accountability versus impunity. For decades, governance across the Republic has operated within the shadow of elite accommodation, where political elites protect their own while working families bear the catastrophic costs of systemic decline. When state contracts are treated as private spoils and regulatory frameworks are manipulated to shield illicit accumulation, the legal system ceases to function as an instrument of constitutional protection. Not law, not justice, enforcement. True sovereignty cannot exist when public resources are siphoned into private luxury, while millions of citizens remain trapped in structural poverty. Economic recovery is fundamentally indivisible from the restoration of human dignity. Before we reach our conclusion, remember what you are witnessing is the unfolding struggle of a nation demanding its rightful dignity. If you believe in fearless political analysis that goes beyond conventional headlines, take a stand with us. Subscribe to South African Dynamics right now, hit the bell notification, and walk beside us as we chronicle this historic journey toward justice and economic sovereignty. The historical trajectory of South Africa now stands at an unprecedented crossroads. The emerging political reality proves that cosmetic adjustments can no longer contain the growing demand for genuine transformation. If the state continues to prioritize elite preservation over the welfare of its people, the crisis will inevitably deepen. If a government refuses to invest in domestic industry, if it continues to abandon its youth, and if it allows the commodification of vital public goods to go unchecked, the erosion of democratic legitimacy becomes irreversible. Conversely, if the collective will of the population can finally dismantle institutional corruption and bridge the chasm between constitutional promise and material reality, the Republic may yet witness a profound political and industrial renaissance. Yet, as the echoes of the assembly at Pietermaritzburg reverberate across the 9 provinces, an ultimate constitutional reckoning remains unresolved. What unfolded at Pietermaritzburg City Hall is far more than an ordinary political address. It is a foundational challenge to the prevailing democratic settlement of South Africa. As this defining Julius Malema speech has demonstrated, a society cannot heal its historical wounds while administrative corruption goes unpunished and millions of working families remain trapped in systemic poverty. When public goods like electricity and healthcare are commodified, and when the promises of constitutional democracy fail to reach the most vulnerable, the demand for radical accountability ceases to be a factional slogan. It becomes an urgent moral imperative. The unresolved questions surrounding the Phala Phala scandal continue to cast a long shadow over national governance, serving as an enduring reminder of the divide between elite privilege and public welfare. True liberation was never meant to be an exchange of political figureheads presiding over unchanged economic hardship. If power changes hands but not structure, has anything really changed? The message echoing from this historic Julius Malema speech is clear. A sovereign nation must be built on the unyielding pillars of human dignity, transparent leadership, and the productive empowerment of its people. The road ahead requires courage, decisive action, and an unwavering refusal to accept managed decline as the permanent condition of the Republic. The struggle for economic freedom is not merely about political representation. It is about reclaiming the right of every citizen to live with dignity, security, and genuine economic opportunity. A nation that honors the sacrifices of its past must possess the political will to reconstruct its industrial foundations and secure the future of its youth. Thank you for joining South African Dynamics in this rigorous analytical journey. We invite you to share your perspective in the comments below. Engage with our community of thoughtful viewers and stay committed to the pursuit of truth and accountability across the African continent.